I hope you enjoyed the metaphor reading. It was quite a bit different than a lot of other things that we've been reading. A little more up to date, a little bit easier to follow, I hope. And I hope you had some aha moments. I hope there were some parts of that reading that made you think, oh, that explains why we say that. Because really, Lakoff and Johnson's approach is to look at metaphor as something we live by, something that structures the way we think, how we operate, how we argue. And so I think this is a very useful concept for us to use in rhetoric. Now, it's been around a long time. We're going to look at it as a contemporary rhetorical theory because the leading scholars that we're reading are from 1980. So let's talk about some of the key principles that Lakoff and Johnson set forth for metaphor. Here's one key concept. Metaphor is not necessarily connected to imagery. Now, sometimes it is. There are metaphors involving, games, families, war, things that are easy to visualize. But there were lots of other things that were not so easy to visualize. Directions, containers, objects, things that are a little bit less visual in focus. And a lot of metaphors operate without the benefit of imagery. Another key concept, and this is really the way Lakoff and Johnson define metaphor, is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. So they really see metaphor as a relationship between two things. So not your high school definition of, an analogy not using like or as, but a relationship between two things that helps us understand one of them in terms of the other. That's really the nature of metaphor, and I think that helps us understand how it's such a key part of the way we make sense of the world around us. A third concept about metaphor is that even though metaphor is sometimes an intentional figure of speech, for example, several years ago, Jesse Jackson was speaking at the Democratic National Convention, and he gave a speech in which he talked about the Democratic Party is a quilt. And he talked about the different groups that are part of the party and how they're all joined together and they work together even though they're separate. Clearly he knew what he was doing there. He was intentionally using that metaphor to help people get an idea of how he saw the Democratic Party. But it doesn't always have to be that way. So this is not just form added to information. It's really both, because there are so many things that we can't even think about outside of terms of metaphor. And my favorite example from the reading was argument is war. And so it's hard for us to even think of anything but winning an argument or losing an argument, or defending our position against other people's attacks against us. Now, those are not physical attacks and defenses, and yet it's the way we think about argument. And so in that case, we're not making an intentional choice. I'm going to think argument is war. It's just a part of how we live and think. Now, in your rhetorical criticism, if you think you see a metaphor at work, it doesn't matter if the speaker or the writer was doing it on purpose. What matters is if you can show how that metaphor plays out in the speech or in the document and how it has a significant role. So if you can find evidence to support the existence and contribution of the metaphor, then it's there. It doesn't matter if you know whether it was intentional or not. And then a fourth key concept about metaphor is that the structure and relationships that a metaphor creates are only partial. They're not total. And you've probably heard the saying that every analogy breaks down. Well, essentially, this is where analogies do apply to metaphors because the relationship is not complete. So for example, argument is war. Okay, so we defend, we attack, we take sides. All these are a part of our thinking about argument. And yet, we can't go into how many people were wounded or killed in this argument. Then that's part of war. It's getting a little bit outside of us. If we start talking about specific weaponry or something, certain helicopters or missiles or something, we're getting beyond what argument can get us to. So these relationships are not total. There is a point at which argument is not war in every sense of the word. But war helps us think about and make sense of argument. And that brings us to Lakoff and Johnson's formula, really, for talking about metaphor. Again, it's a relationship. And so a metaphor has to be stated in this simple sentence: X is Y. Or in this example here, war is hell. The idea here is that the tenor is the idea that we're trying to understand or make understood. The vehicle is some idea that we think people already have a good sense of. And so the vehicle, if this helps you remember it, kind of carries along the tenor. So if this is our tenor, it kind of sits down in the little vehicle, and the vehicle drives it down the road. So the vehicle carries that tenor along. So in this case, people who've been in the military have said repeatedly, war is hell. Now, most of us probably haven't experienced either one, but the idea is we have a sense of what hell would be like. It's stereotypically what? Very unpleasant. There's fire, there's pain, it's unending, it's, I don't know what your image might be of a hellish environment, but maybe noisy, maybe just all the worst things you can think of right there in one place. So if we have a pretty decent conceptualization of that, these military veterans say, okay, war is hell. So if you have a sense of hell, now you have a better sense of war, because sometimes war is kind of romanticized. It's, it's strategy, or it's a way to be a hero. This metaphor tries to break that down by putting it in terms of something that we understand. Now, this is a really key contribution, I think, of Lakoff and Johnson, this idea of the simple sentence, because sometimes people talk about metaphors without naming the tenor. So they'll say something like, oh, clearly this person is using a family metaphor. Okay, well, they haven't told us, what is the family? What is this relationship between something and family? Now, imagine if this worked with a regular relationship, interpersonally, and somebody said, so are you in a relationship? And you said, yes, as a matter of fact, I am. And the person said, well, with whom? Who are you in the relationship with? And you said, oh, I'm in a relationship. I mean, why do we have to nail down specifics? That would just be flaky, wouldn't it? And so in a metaphor, it's the same way. So if something is operating in the metaphor, X is family, what is X? In a political speech, is the United States a family? Is the world of nations a family? Is this particular region that the president's talking about a family? Is the president's staff a family? It could be any number of things. And as a critic, it's our job to nail that down and put it in this kind of format. So if you use metaphor for your major paper on rhetoric, make sure that you state it in this form: X is Y, tenor is vehicle, because that helps us understand both parts of the relationship. One specific category of metaphors that Lakoff and Johnson talk about is the orientational metaphor. And here's one example. These are all metaphors that are based on some kind of physical direction: up, down, left, right. And usually, Lakoff and Johnson argue, these metaphors have a physical basis for their existence. So let's think about this one. Happy is up, sad is down. And of course, they gave you several examples of both of those, but we might think about ways that we use this metaphor in everyday expressions. I feel like I'm walking on air. So you're up, you're clearly happy. Somebody's head is in the clouds. She's excited, she's happy, that's up. On the other hand, the flip side is you're down in the dumps, or you're feeling depressed, right? Even that term buys into this metaphor. So happy is up, sad is down. Now, think about what a physical basis for this metaphor might be. If you're happy, what does your mouth do? It turns up, right? If you're sad, it turns down at the corners, just like this. Think about your posture. If you're happy, you're probably standing up straight. You might have a little spring in your step. If you're sad, you're probably slumped over. Maybe you're even looking down at the ground. If we're happy, we say things are looking up, right? And so this has a physical basis, but we've adopted it into a lot of our language. This is one of those we probably don't consciously think about. It is clearly a metaphor we live by. Here's another example of an orientational metaphor. Control is up, lack of control is down. Now think of a physical basis for this way back, cave person days perhaps. If you have to fight somebody, which ground is the better, the high ground or the low ground? The high ground, because with the high ground, you have more control. You're fighting down, you have a lot better chance of winning. So in a very ancient kind of way, This makes sense. Control is up, lack of control is down. Now, we've adopted it in lots of different ways, especially in organizations. So we talk about an organizational hierarchy. That's an imaginary thing. It's just the way our minds make sense of leaders and followers. I mean, leaders and followers could just as easily be in terms of like running a race where control was ahead and lack of control was behind, right? But we've bought into control is up, lack of control is down. We even talk about our superiors above, and they talk about their subordinates below. Now, again, that's not a physical relationship now, but it's a metaphor based on that physical orientation. We might even say that's an idea I'll have to send up the flagpole to see what people above me have to say. Or you might say, oh, right now I'm low man on the totem pole. And what you mean is you have less control in the organization because your superiors are above you, at least figuratively. Let's look at one other orientational example. This might be one that you've already thought about. Conservative is right, liberal is left. This started in the last days of the French monarchy, where the legislative body was assembled such that the people that were still loyal to the monarchy, that wanted to keep things more or less the way they were on the right, and the rabble-rousers that wanted to change things up, they were on the left. And so we started to associate conservative with right and liberal with left. And to this very day in the United States, we still use this metaphor. And we don't spell it out like this. We just say, oh, maybe that's a left-leaning think tank. And what we mean is that's a place where people who have liberal philosophies and ideas work. Or we might say, oh, that's a right-wing organization. And we mean it's conservative, that it has a set of views that we associate with conservatism. And so we use right as sort of a shorthand. Orientational metaphors. One other thing that's kind of fun about metaphors is that they are compact, but they're also vivid. So just a few words that buy into a relationship can give us a certain impression or feeling. I've done some research on the way companies use language when they're laying workers off. And what I found is not all companies use the same metaphor. So in one case that I found, for example, the CEO made an announcement that talked about having to stop the bleeding, that this was going to be a painful process. It was going to take a long time for the company to recover and to heal, that cuts were going to have to be made, but that somehow we had to heal. Now, that suggests that workforce reduction is surgery. Now, an alternative frame that another company used was that the company had to be leaner in order to survive, that it had a lot of competitive pressure, and so it had to get smaller in order to be more competitive. And so that metaphor, with some other examples, I termed as workforce reduction is survival of the fittest. Now look at the difference in how that treats the people who get laid off. In the first case, the people who get laid the people who get laid off are cut out like a tumor or a cancer. They're making the company die. They're making it sick. And so they have to be excised so the company can recover and heal. In the other case, survival of the fittest, they're not really damaging the company that much. They're slowing it down a little bit. They're not as fit, and so the company has to kind of shed they're not a cancer, they're just not really helping anything. Now, it gives you a different way of looking at those layoffs depending on the metaphor that's used. And with just a few words, we get these vivid ideas. I might use a metaphor about COM 204, since it's one of our foundational courses in the university core and also in communication, that COM 204 is a restaurant. Now, intentionally, I could do this. I could say that I'm trying to present you with a buffet of ideas. I want to give you the flavor of different ways of thinking about communication texts, that I hope you'll find our ideas appealing or appetizing. If they're not to your taste, then I'll try something different. But you're just kind of I'm trying to give you a menu of ideas so that you can make sense of them. Now, that might have made you a little bit hungry, all that talk. So if so, go ahead and stop and get yourself a snack. That's one of the benefits of watching this on video. But it gives you another example of how metaphor can be compact, just a few words, a few examples, but very vivid. It can really help evoke feelings and associations just because of that relationship. Now, there is a way in which metaphor can be abused. And so I want to mention that metaphor simultaneously obscures and brings to light. So when we think of two things in terms of another, or one thing in terms of a second thing, it means that we don't think about it in terms of different things. So let's take argument is war, for example. Lakoff and Johnson used the example that we don't think about argument is a dance. Doesn't make sense. But you might be able to kind of get out of your American mindset to think of how it might make sense, where you take one step and somebody else takes another step. That argument might involve some cooperation and some collaboration in order to get where you want to be. It might be something where you can learn techniques to be better at arguing with other people. All those things fit with dancing, not so much with war. So when we think about it as war, we think of winners and losers. If you think about it as dancing, it's a lot more cooperative, isn't it? It's a lot less antagonistic. And so thinking about it in one way makes us not think about it in another way. Here's an example of a couple of metaphors that have been appropriated over the centuries to make people think about dark and light in certain ways. So look at these. Good is light, evil is dark, knowledge is light, ignorance is dark. These are ancient. I mean, they were in Plato's cave 2,400 years ago. They're in the Bible. These are ancient metaphors. And yet, in the last few hundred years, people have used these ideas to justify treating people with lighter skin as smarter and better than people with darker skin. Because they've chosen to see skin color in terms of these metaphors, and not just a way of thinking that I'm sure is based on some primeval desire to be in the light instead of the darkness, because you can see the dangers that are coming to you in the light. You understand, you have the knowledge that comes with the light, whereas in the dark you can't see what's around you, you're ignorant. Now, that's really where those metaphors came from, but they've been used in ways that oppress people, because they give people a certain way of thinking about color instead of alternative ways of thinking about color. One last example of metaphor in action. Several years ago, Disneyland in Anaheim, California had a strike. And it had never happened before. The economy was rough in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And so Disney laid some workers off for the first time. And as a result, there was a strike at Disneyland. And while this was going on, some communication researchers went to Anaheim and interviewed members of labor and members of management to try to get a sense of how they saw this conflict. What they found was this: labor and management operated with different metaphors about what it meant to work at Disney. And this list gives you a couple of examples of the different frames that workers and managers used at Disney. One group thought of Disneyland as drama or show business. And they talked about, they called employees cast members, they talked about being on stage or off stage. Central casting was where people got their costumes instead of getting uniforms at the wardrobe department. They talked about guests rather than customers. That was one way of thinking about it. The other group thought of Disneyland as family. And even though Walt Disney had been dead for several years, a lot of them talked about him as still kind of being the father figure that was kind of over everything, that everybody still thought of and respected. Disney had a family picnic each year, their employee party. They called a family picnic at the time. There was a lot of focus on teamwork, on helping each other out. And that seemed to fall into this mindset that Disney is family. Now maybe you can guess which side was which. Management saw it as show business. Labor saw it as family. So you can imagine how, to management, times are tough. You got to go on with the show. We've got to lay some people off to save money. But if you think of your job as a family, well, stop and think about it. Do you have any family members you wish you could fire? You probably do. But you can't. You're stuck with them, right? They're related to you. And so if you think about your job as a family, the idea that some members of the family can be let go just doesn't make sense. And so these different metaphors helped create the conflict that led to a strike at the happiest place on earth. Now today, Disney has been much more conscious about using this metaphor, Disney is show business or Disney is drama, because it allows them to do a lot more things on the business side of things than they could with the governing metaphor, Disney is family. So metaphor isn't just the way we think and live, it has real world impacts. And so as you're working on your rhetoric major paper, I hope you'll keep your eyes open for maybe a metaphor that you might be able to talk about as making a significant contribution to your speech.